I'm James Atkinson, and this is Drinks Adventures, the podcast where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and explore trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Welcome to Season 3 of the Drinks Adventures podcast, which gets underway with a visit to one of Australia's most successful craft distilleries. Four Pillars Gin was founded by Cameron Mackenzie, Matt Jones and Stuart Gregor in 2013. The company has doubled its sales year on year and in 2019 expects to sell 500,000 bottles of its gin in 30 different export markets globally. This rapid growth did not go unnoticed by some of the drinks industry's larger players. In early 2019, Four Pillars sold a 50% stake in its business to brewer Lion, the company behind 4X, Tooheys, Little Creatures and myriad other Australian beer brands. I caught up with Cameron recently at Four Pillars Distillery in Healesville, Victoria, and you can hear our chat right after this message from another one of our valued sponsors. Cam, thanks so much for joining me on the Drinks Adventures podcast.
Absolute pleasure, James. Good to be here.
When I was just sitting downstairs, I was reading a little bit of background about Four Pillars, and it sort of struck me there's still quite a few things that I don't know about the business. Being in Sydney, I've obviously had a fair bit to do with Stu, but never met you before, and I don't know about the third co-founder. So how did the three of you come together to launch the brand?
Well, first, let me apologise for anything Stu has said and done in the past. We do that a lot in this business. Stu and I have been mates we worked it out just recently, we've been mates for 20 years. He and I met in the wine industry 20 years ago. I was an athlete trying to make the Sydney Olympic Games as a 400 metre runner. I'd come back from the Atlanta Olympics in '96, so I ran in the 4x4 relay, and I was quite keen to try and make the Sydney team. The problem with that was that somewhere in the middle I met Stu, and I think if you put my athletic career on a graph and my career in the wine industry or in the alcohol industry on a graph, the point at which the athletic career plummeted and the booze career took off is the exact day I think I met Stu. So we just became really great mates working in the wine industry together. We worked for, at the time it was called Beringer Blass, which I guess went on to become Treasury. I had been working out at a winery called Yarra Ridge and St Hubert's with Rob Dolan, and over time just sort of moved further and further away from getting my hands dirty and being in production to more winery management, which I loved, but I kind of always was at my happiest wandering around dragging hoses and tasting things and crushing fruit and filling barrels. So over time, I guess I just got too far away from that. And then Stu and I just were chatting one day about, what the opportunities were out there to maybe do something outside of wine. At the time, we actually thought tonic water. Going back 7 or 8 years ago in Australia, it was really just Schweppes and Kirk's. There was no Fever Tree or Cappy or East Imperial or any interesting things happening in that space. I looked into it pretty heavily, but to be honest, the reason we balked at it was I couldn't build a soft drink factory. I'd have to have it all made under contract, in which case I was back behind a desk and I wasn't getting my hands dirty again. So we kind of walked away from it. As it turns out, looking at the success of Fever Tree, that may well have been a very good dog to back. But we kind of revisited it and said, well, maybe we should have a look at distilling instead. And I think the reason we hadn't done that is it was really hard to get a licence back then. There wasn't a great knowledge bank for distilling in Australia because we didn't have much of an industry. So we sort of persevered, but from making that decision to actually opening and launching the first gin took us nearly 2 years. I think it was about 22 months from that decision to launch. Matt Jones, who is the third partner in the business, Matt came about because I think Stu and I were quite conscious that we wanted this to be a really proper, serious business. A business we could have a huge amount of fun in, a business we could be quite creative in, but we didn't want it to be a folly. It was particularly important to me because, I was quitting a job and, I've mortgage, wife, 3 kids. It was a fairly daunting thing to go and do. Stu had a great PR communications business in Sydney that he owned and was running and was quite successful. So Matt came in originally to sort of write that strategy, tell us what the opportunities were, and pitched to us that maybe he should be the third partner, and we just thought that was a great idea. So the 3 of us have worked together ever since, and we're really close mates, and I don't know, still having a huge amount of fun.
And what did Matt bring to the trio?
So Matt very much sets what I say is the language of the business. Matt will brief designers, he will brief social media content, brief website content. He's incredibly creative, very, very strategic. He times and plans things very, very well. I always laugh and say that I make gin, Stu makes noise, and Matt makes sense. The tinker, the thinker and the drinker. This is how the 3 of us have always worked. So the 3 of us bounce off each other very well. And I think it's a unique trio to have in a business, to have someone who has a solid background in production and scaling production, someone who's fantastic at relationships, fantastic at trade, media, communications, also an incredibly creative individual, and then have this third person who's crucial to our business, setting that language and making sure we don't miss opportunities. He's got this great ability to kind of stay small but think big, and we always wanted to try and build more of a global Australian-made spirit rather than a cottage spirit. And they both have their place. There's a fantastic opportunity for tiny distilleries to sell at farm gate and sell into their local town or their local city. That wasn't what we were trying to do. We wanted to be able to build a business and see our products on the shelf around the world, because you do with wine, you do even with beer, but for some reason Australian spirits has never really taken off, and we thought that was something that could be righted, with a bit of hard work.
And when you set out to create your first product, Rare Dry Gin, it's obviously the engine room of the 4 Pillars business, were you trying to make something that was, uniquely Australian, or were you trying to make something that was fairly classic, or was it a sort of bridging the gap between those two things?
Yeah, look, I reckon early on we talked more about what we didn't want to make versus what we did want to make. We didn't want to make London Dry Gin. All of us could see what was happening with gin in the UK, and I don't think we couldn't predict at the time what has happened. We knew there was growth, but there's extreme growth there. But we just thought, even at the time, the world didn't need another London Dry Gin made by 3 bald Australian blokes. We just thought there's got to be more opportunity out there, and that was where Matt's sort of strategic document to us to talk about what that opportunity was, gin didn't innovate. It didn't create anything for probably 30 or 40 years, from the 60s when vodka hit through to Bombay Sapphire. It's probably the late 90s where we started to see things change in gin, better marketing of gin, slightly different styles, Tanqueray 10, ultimately Hendrick's, and it changed the way people were starting to think. So we said straight up, let's not make London Dry Gin. The opportunity is to make a more contemporary style of gin, a more modern style of gin. Then we sort of talked about Australia and Australian gin, and the first thing we sort of said was, well, Australia's part of Asia, so that seems ridiculous to try and make an Australiana gin. That, again, might be relevant to someone, but it wasn't sort of what we felt was the opportunity. We felt the opportunity was modern Australia. So what's modern Australia? And we started to have these great discussions. We'd look at menus, we'd talk to chefs, to artists. I was really fortunate to work in the Yarra Valley through that period when winemakers out here realised, we can't make Burgundy. We can make Yarra Valley Chardonnay and we can make Yarra Valley Pinot, but we're not in Burgundy, so let's stop trying to make Burgundy and make these incredible regional wines. So we didn't go through any sort of cultural cringe with 4 Pillars. We said, let's just make a modern Australian gin, which is taking botanicals and ingredients from around the world, but also using some really interesting native stuff as well. And that was sort of, I guess, how we arrived at Rare Dry Gin. That recipe took 18 months to fine tune and tweak and calibrate. A lot of that during our sort of Breaking Bad phase with a little glass lab still, and then when Wilma, our first Carl still arrived, I still used that for about 3.5, 4 months making gin before we had the guts to actually release that gin.
Had you got any background in distilling, or were you, basically just taking your winemaking background and then learning how to distill?
Exactly that, taking a production background and learning how to distill. I'm still to this day terrified of it. It's not winemaking, it's not brewing, it's distilling, and, ethanol and alcohol vapour is a very dangerous thing. So that was the bit I was most terrified of. It wasn't making gin, it wasn't an inability to get the flavours right. I think if you come from a food background, you come from a wine background, flavour, balance, weight, texture are things that come pretty naturally to you. For me, it was safety. So I spent a lot of my time researching distilling, talking more about safety and how not to blow up. Than actually recipe creation. I was never particularly worried about it. We're pretty transparent here. We get a lot of people coming in who want to start distilleries, and we want to build an industry in Australia. So we're incredibly transparent. And it amazes me the number of people that come in and want to start talking about bloody lemon myrtle. And I sit there and look at them and say, well, what about the power, the water? What are you going to do with your effluent? Do you know anything about safety? Let's go 5 steps back and let's talk about that. And these are the questions you need to be asking, because lemon myrtle, we can talk about that later on. That's the fun bit of distilling. So yeah, I didn't have a distilling background. I had a production background. I understood it. I just wanted to be properly safe and make sure as we grew that we were properly safe and all our team was safe.
Now tell me about the recipe you did end up settling on for rare dried gin, because it is, from my understanding, still quite a juniper forward gin, importantly.
Yeah, one of the pivotal things for Stu and I was a road trip we did from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles. Somehow convinced our wives it was research and development. We just visited distilleries every day for about 2 weeks, driving down the West Coast. And what was amazing to us was at the end of the day, we would often have a bit of a chat about some of the products we'd tasted and some of the gins, and we'd arrive at a gin and we'd say, you know what, that was a really good drink, but it wasn't gin. It didn't have enough juniper in it. It didn't have that discernible juniper character. So whilst it's modern and it's contemporary, it's flavoured vodka. We want it to be gin. So where we arrived at with rare dry gin is the base of juniper is still about 80% of the botanical base on that. So it exceeds London Dry Gin's juniper requirement quite substantially. But it doesn't smell or taste anything like London Dry Gin, so we've never called it that. I've never entered it in anything as that. It's unashamedly modern and contemporary. So we have a big canvas of juniper. That is hugely important to us. Coriander, which is the second most used botanical in gin globally. We use some Australian coriander, but we don't use a huge amount of it. It's very citrus-based coriander. When you grind it up, it's actually quite bright and quite lemony. We've got other great forms of citrus that we can use. So we use a bit of coriander for some earthiness. We use some green cardamom from Guatemala, some cassia from India, some star anise from Vietnam, a little bit of lavender, which we use to help lift aromatics, a little bit of angelica as a fixative and a binder. The 2 native botanicals we use in that gin are the leaf of the Tasmanian pepperberry, very pesto green tea, white pepper, lemon myrtle, which I think is probably the botanical that will put Australian gin on the map. Hopefully that's 4 Pillars, but I suspect a Tanqueray or a Bombay Sapphire or someone will start using lemon myrtle as one of their exotic botanicals. And then the last one was an interesting one. We were using dried orange peel in our test batches, and I particularly hated it. It just had this marmalade-y, kind of advanced candied character. And we couldn't get our head around it at all, and we wanted some soft citrus, we wanted some orange, but it just wasn't the character that we wanted. And a German distiller from Karl, who make our stills, a guy called Dr. Klaus Hagmann, because if you're going to be a German distiller, that is the name you would want. Klaus came and visited me as we were fine-tuning, and he agreed that that was all wrong, that dried peel, and kind of incredulously just said to me, I don't understand you, why wouldn't you just use fresh citrus? You're Australia, you can get fresh citrus all year round. And as it turns out, we can get organic, unwaxed oranges for pretty much 12 months of the year. And that changed everything. That changed the entire dynamic of that gin. That lovely, bright Mediterranean sort of orange character is unmistakably different to using peel, which is more advanced and weirdly more London dry-ish in its profile. So those were the 10 botanicals that we sort of narrowed it down to. After distilling about 94 botanicals, we distilled it down to 10.
And that's still by far the biggest part of the Four Pillars business?
Yeah, I'd say probably 85% of our time here is rare dry gin. It's kind of our non-vintage champagne. You know, that's the gin. We also, part of that brief was to be able to make that gin 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So I needed to make sure all of those ingredients were available all the time. There's no point in us using an ingredient that's available 3 weeks of the year. So that was very much part of the brief for that. But that gin is also incredibly important to us because we use it a lot. I use it in our barrel aging program. It's the basis of Bloody Shiraz gin. I use a little bit of it in Christmas gin. It's kind of more than just rare dry gin. It's our highest selling gin. I'm not supposed to choose one of my kids as a favourite, but that one is, for me, my go-to of our gins. And it's been super consistent and continues to do really well.
How was the Bloody Shiraz gin conceived? Because that looks to have been a bit of a masterstroke.
I think a lot of our experiments never see the light of day, which is a good thing. But this was one where, again, gin didn't innovate. You know, I didn't create anything for that big, long period of time when I was growing up, you know, and when I was in my early 20s. Gin was my mum's drink, my grandmother's drink. It didn't change. And what we found was people kept asking us when we were going to make a slow gin. And I kept scratching my head saying, well, I hate almost every slow gin I've ever tasted. You know, I don't like marzipan. And often those slow gins will pick up a bit of a marzipan character. I don't like adding sugar to things. I barely add sugar to anything when I'm cooking. And to make slow gin, you have to add a bucket load of sugar because sloe berries are so acidic. And we don't really grow sloes. So I started asking people who would ask me, when are you going to make a slow gin? I'd say, well, which one do you drink and how do you drink it? And people would say, oh, I've never actually had one, I've just heard of it. And it was kind of almost just a default question. So we said, well, that's not enough for us to go and make a slow gin. Truthfully, we did make one, we never released it. It was as revolting as I thought it would be. We were based at a winery, we had a background in wine, and during vintage we just happened to get our hands on a small parcel of fruit that had come through from a grower. Rob Dolan, where we were based, kind of went, look, I really don't know what to do with such a small parcel. It was only about 250 kilos. So I kind of appropriated it from him and destemmed it, tipped high-proof rare dry gin straight out of the still. So it comes out of our stills at about 93% ABV. So I tipped that over the grapes. So there's no fermentation, there's no barrels, it's Shiraz grapes. That alcohol bleeds the colour, the flavour, the sweetness out of the grapes. And we let it sit for between 6 and 8 weeks. These days we do 2 harvests in the vineyard. We pick quite early to get pepper, spice, you know, white pepper and red berries, and then we pick a little bit later to give us more colour, more darker fruit flavours. We press it off, the grape juice brings the ABV down, and we add more gin and get it up to 37.8. And it just worked. You know, we don't add sugar, we don't add colour. It's the reason we just kept adding gin to it is when we pressed it the first time, it tasted delicious and it smelt amazing, but it was just fortified grape juice. Well, we want to be a gin distillery. So we said, no, let's just add more gin until we taste and smell gin. So we just kept adding gin. And when it got to about 37%, we said, hey, now it smells and tastes like gin. So we'll just bottle it at that, 37.8. Cabernet didn't work. It was too herbaceous. Merlot didn't work. It was a bit weird. I'm too Scottish to buy Pinot Noir, so that was never going to work. But Shiraz out here is a workhorse. It's the perfect variety for what we wanted to do. In a cold vintage, you get spicy, bright, medium-bodied Shiraz. In a hot vintage, you get darker fruits, black pepper. Wet vintage, it deals with it. Hot vintage, it deals with it. It's just the perfect variety for what we wanted. And, to go from 250 kilos, this year we did just north of 100 tonnes. And I still think we'll run out. So it's been quite a journey with that little gin.
Stu told me a while ago that he's crushed a lot more Shiraz to make gin than he ever did as a winemaker.
Well, there's that, but that also is a very clear reflection on the wines that Stu and I made. We're much better making Shiraz gin than we ever were making wine. I actually think it's probably only De Bortoli's in the Yarra Valley that would crush more Shiraz than us. I think we are certainly crushing more Shiraz than most of the wineries out here. I can't think of anyone who would crush more than 100 tonnes of Shiraz for their own use. And next year, if I can get my hands on it, we'll probably do 120, 130 tonnes. So.
You've obviously started expanding overseas, probably been happening for a few years now, but what's been the reaction to products like that are really, really uniquely Australian, but not just uniquely Australian, they make a real regional statement about the Yarra Valley as well?
Yeah, it's been phenomenal actually. It's a huge opportunity for us as we continue to grow. We've got nearly 30 export markets now. None of them particularly huge, but it's a really interesting footprint. And as the bar scene is growing and people are taking their gin lists more and more seriously, you can't ignore Australia. There's so much going on down here. We're known as, a country of innovation, a country of produce. So with rare dry gin, certainly, we've had great interest in that and sales were quite strong. When we released Bloody Shiraz gin, it was suddenly very, very different because it's not something a lot of countries can easily replicate. The UK at the moment is a tsunami of gin brands. But they can't do a Shiraz gin. They don't grow Shiraz. And if they do, the English wine scene is probably more sparkling based. So it's a very hard one for someone to come in and do. Flavoured gin appears to be a huge opportunity. I think that's probably something you're going to see more and more distilleries doing, whether it's sloes or whether it's rhubarb or strawberry or whatever. Flavoured gin is certainly something that's taking off. I think what seems to work really well for us in those markets is it's a product that's an absolute genuine product. It's a gin, it's relevant, it's got a great story to it, it's got a great background to it. It's not an opportunistic gin that we've made and just to fill a gap. It's actually a really great gin to drink. Watching bartenders play with it has been amazing. So in a way, I think that's probably the gin that will open doors for us on the export market. The problem for us is going to be making enough of it to do that, because I want to keep it flowing in Australia before it goes anywhere else. So we've got little allocations of it overseas, and the reaction's been amazing. Really, really cool.
Can you notice much vintage variation between the different releases of the Bloody Shiraz?
Yeah, they're more subtle now. I think in 2017, fruit out here, it wasn't a big year for colour out here. It was quite a cloudy vintage, so we didn't get huge colour development in vineyards. And we picked all the fruit at once. We soaked it, didn't matter how long we soaked it. It was quite a pale Shiraz gin, despite the fact that the sweetness level was pretty much the same as the previous year. It was peppery and spicy, it tasted amazing, but you could hold up the bottle and pretty much see through it. And the feedback was, everyone loves it, and it's still sold out because we didn't make that much of it, but people were starting to say, they're pushing it a bit now, they're making too much of it. You can see it in the colour. And we said, well, it's actually got nothing to do, we didn't even look at colour. So we said, okay, I think there's some vintage trends that we can iron out ourselves to get a slightly more consistent product, but still have a couple of little vintage variants. So by doing the 2 harvests and picking quite early, we get that lovely spice and red berry, and then picking quite late, we get more colour and sort of dark berry flavours. You still get a big variation in spice. What we're seeing is less variation in colour and sweetness now. The biggest thing will be spice, and I think the benchmark for us was 2018, 2019. Those 2 gins have been so consistent. That's the quality we want to keep it at going forward.
Many of the gin distilleries in Australia ultimately have ambitions of releasing whiskey, and gin is kind of like it's purely a financially driven thing. Do you think that it's been an important element of Four Pillars' success that you've just focused on doing one thing and doing it really well?
Yeah, look, for us, there's no doubt that's the case. We said when Matt did that original strategic sort of 2-pager, and it was very casual, it wasn't a heavy-hitting document. It was just stating the obvious to us, to be honest. And he was the one who said, you've just got to concentrate on gin, just do it well. And there's so much room to move within gin, so many different flavours that you can play with, I'm sure, and he kind of left that up to me. I think just being able to concentrate on that was then confirmed when we did that road trip through the US, because we'd go to so many distilleries and we'd walk out saying, gee, that gin was amazing, but I didn't really like their rye, or their vodka was pretty harsh, but their absinthe was good, or whatever. But it was rare that we walked out of a distillery and said, I loved all 6 of those spirits. Whereas here, I think by concentrating on gin, there's variance within it, but people generally have walked away enjoying a gin. And that's been a huge advantage to us, to just play within the category like that.
Obviously, a few months ago, you made the decision to sell a percentage of the business. Was that something that you thought, was on the cards when you launched? Was it part of the plan, or how did that evolve?
Yeah, look, it certainly wasn't really part of the plan. I guess we hoped that we would have success at some point, and we didn't really know what success looked like, to be honest. Success for me was just being able to pay my mortgage and have a sustainable job and grow, What we found over time was we had such momentum, and we continue to have such great momentum. We've never taken any shortcuts with anything, not in production, not in any of our branding, absolutely nothing. We've invested and invested and invested. The business suddenly was profitable earlier than I think any of us thought it would be, and we weren't taking anything out of the business. We were just putting money back in. We had an amazing group of investors on board, an incredible group of friends and family who supported us early on. But what we could see on the horizon was our momentum was, on a certain trajectory, but our profitability and our little war chest of funds was going to get chewed up pretty quickly. So I guess you're faced with a decision. Do you put a ceiling on your potential as a business and just hold your cards, be a nice little profitable distillery, have a bit of fun, or do you go back to the original goal, which is we want a global craft spirit? And the 3 of us were never anything than on the same page, that no, we want a global craft spirit. All of our little investors were on board saying, this is just so much fun, let's just keep going with that. We want to see the growth. They were getting a kick out of going on holidays somewhere and finding a bottle of gin in a bar, in the UK or something. It was amazing. So whilst we weren't really looking for that investment, we knew at some point we probably had to address it. As Stu would say, we were invited to the dance by quite a few companies, and that was a really interesting discussion too, if I can say, because they're not discussions I'm used to. A few of those companies wanted to fix us, which I thought was hilarious because I didn't feel we were broken. But you could see that they were looking at some of our projects that are not profitable. We're not making money out of gin pigs or marmalade or things like that. We do it because we have a genuine, fun thing to do there. Why wouldn't you reuse all your oranges and make marmalade? Why wouldn't you feed botanicals to pigs and do gin pig dinners? It was fun for us, and it's been an important part of our sustainability as a business. So you could kind of see that would be the first thing that would go if we partnered with the wrong partner. When Lion approached us, I think we walked out of the first meeting saying, well, that's the most sense we've heard in 18 months, and we didn't think it would be because it's a beer company. But they were very much, look, we want to continue your momentum. We want to help you continue it. We're not trying to take you away from the steering wheel. It's important that you guys stay in this business and keep doing what you're doing. What we want to do is partner with you and invest with you so that you can continue to grow. You can build this property next door. We've been very fortunate in this site in Healesville, which has been an absolute revelation for the business, having a bar and a distillery that's open 7 days a week. From a tourism point of view, we're going to get 80 or 90,000 people through the doors this year. We've managed to acquire the property next door now, which we will knock over next year. So this partnership with Lion allows us to now continue to develop the footprint of this business in production, in tourism, hospitality. So that's been a massive, massive relief for us as well. Has it changed the business? Not one bit. So in a way, where I see the great potential for us and where the guys at Lion are really keen to help us out are things like compliance, safety, OH&S, bit of HR stuff, things that we've done okay at, but because we grew so rapidly, we probably haven't done as well at, procurement, these sorts of things. We've just been thinking on the fly. So we can kind of go to them and ask their advice, but they are in no hurry to be ringing us to tell me to make a cheesecake gin or something. That's just of no interest to them. What they want to do is see the culture of the business, the innovation of the business continue to grow and the quality of the products to remain consistent.
And presumably they're opening up some new channels for you as well?
Look, interestingly, they're not, from a distribution point of view, they've actually partnered with our national distributor, with Vanguard Luxury Brands as well. But outside of that, they're not big exporters, Lion. They don't do a huge amount overseas. So again, that ball is in our court to select our importers and work with those partners. So where they're helpful is helping us discuss those contracts, discuss those deals. They're really interesting. They're kind of a very handy big brother for us and a great resource for us to bounce ideas off, but they're in no hurry to jump into the business and start trying to change anything, which is great. I guess rightly we were probably a little bit concerned by it, but we're now 6 or 7 months in, and no, there's just nothing that's been great. Business as usual.
You mentioned that the sideline that you have in making these gin-related consumer goods is, there's no profit in that, but you're sort of investing in building that as a business now, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. Distilling's not the most sustainable industry in the world. We use a lot of power, use a lot of water, a lot of ingredients. So I think if we can soften our footprint in any way, it's a positive thing. What I'd like to do is over the next 12 to 18 months pretty much become almost a zero waste business from a distilling point of view. So we have a program called Made from Gin, and it started out really with marmalade. Every week here we end up with tens of kilos of gin steamed oranges because of the use of fresh organic oranges. You haven't lived until you've eaten half an orange that's been steamed in gin for 5 hours. So why would we throw that on the garden or throw it in general waste? It makes the world's best marmalade. It's kind of the circle of life. There's only so much in my garden that I can tip botanicals on, so we needed to find a home for that. We've got a mate out here who's a pig farmer. He has rare breed Berkshire pigs, so he's now doing gin pigs and about to sort of continue to grow that business, and he's going to sell his gin pigs into various butchers and restaurants. We did our 20th gin pig dinner in Sydney on Wednesday night at 1 penny red. So we work with restaurants and chefs and kind of celebrate cocktails and gin pigs. Matt Wilkinson from Pope Joan in Melbourne, we've actually hired a chef without a kitchen, which is hilarious to me. But his job is to really work with our made from gin products. So he's got a number of things planned over the next 12 or 18 months, whether that's working with other chefs for gin pig dinners or creating a couple of little products that he's playing with as well, that we can continue that. Ideally, I'd just love to make sure that anything that comes on site isn't just turned into gin, it's turned into gin and something else that's useful. And I think we worked it out last week. We've done nearly 60,000 jars of marmalade since we started the business. And it's a local girl here, Caroline Gray, who makes it, and she uses a little 4-litre copper pot on her stove, and she's made nearly 60,000 jars of marmalade. So that's great, we love it. I think it's a really, really fun little side project for all of us, but it's becoming almost a major project within the business.
What else is coming up from an innovation point of view?
Look, there's a whole lot of things that we're playing with all the time. We've got this little still up here. It's a little Carl still that's 75 litres, and it will make about 30 or 40 bottles of gin as good as our production stills. So we're constantly looking at new botanicals. We've also had a really great program of collaborations, whether that's with chefs or bartenders or other distilleries. We did one a couple of years ago in Madrid. We made a gin with Santa Maria Distillery. 3 guys who started a distillery in Madrid making gin, really just great guys. And we made a gin using some Australian botanicals and some Spanish botanicals called Cousin Vera's Gin. They've since been out and made gin with us. So we started this sort of collaborative thing. The The most recent one we did was with Hernö in the north of Sweden, which are probably my favourite gins in the Northern Hemisphere. I think what John and those guys are making is just incredible, pure, clean, concentrated gin. So we took he came out here originally. He managed to get some meadowsweet out to Australia, which was great. And then we used some native botanicals and some traditional botanicals. Last year we went to the north of Sweden with our families, made gin with him, smuggled the Australian botanicals in the kids' luggage. It's much easier to do it that way. No one's looking at a Dora the Explorer suitcase. So that was a huge amount of fun. And then this year we're doing one with Kyoto Distillery that make the Kenobi gin. So Alex is coming out here in October from Kyoto Distillery, and we're going to make some gin here. And then next year we'll head over to Japan and make some gin with him. So we're going to continue those sorts of programs. We'll release our sticky carpet gin towards the end of September, which we made with the Espy Hotel in St Kilda, a bit of an iconic Melbourne pub. So we made a gin that was deliberate. It took a while to make, actually. It was quite a deliberately pubby kind of feel to it. We used some roasted dark stout as part of the base alcohol. We used some hops, some roasted barley as botanicals. So we made quite a malty-ish style of gin. So we're going to release that. So there's lots of little projects that pop up from time to time in our newsletters or at the distillery door here. And otherwise, we're just head down, tail up, just keep making gin.
Been a fascinating chat. I think we can leave it there. Thanks so much for your time, Cam.
Mate, thanks so much for having me. I hope we covered everything off.
Thank you so much to all you wonderful listeners who purchased your limited edition Drinks Adventures drink coasters during the break. I've now uploaded to the podcast website, drinksadventures.com.au, some professional shots of the podcoasters that do justice to Barry Patternord's beautiful artwork. Each set costs just $39.95, including GST and shipping within Australia. For this small price, you get your hands on these quality drink coasters, and you also know that you're helping support us make the Drinks Adventures podcast, which we love doing, but it is a lot of work and an expensive podcast to make. A couple more Apple Podcast reviews that came through during the break. Mark Kay says, just listened to my first episode and it was great. Andrew Durbridge was interesting, and it's great to hear an external perspective of the Australian whisky industry. Great interview, and I'm looking forward to more. Justin3066 says, finally, a tightly edited, informative podcast on the drinks industry. Keep up the great work, James. Thanks, guys. Listeners, you should be like Justin and Mark. Please leave reviews, buy your podcoasters, and I'll see you again soon. The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links, and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.